Relations between China and Australia have been tense, to say the very least, over the last few years. But with the change of government has brought a change to rebuild ties and repair that relationship. The former Australian Foreign Minister Bob Carr believes there are safe ways to improve that relationship. And he joins me now. Bob Carr, good to see you. First of all, we're fresh off the back of that Pacific Islands Forum. That seemed to have gone pretty well. Do you agree?
I do. And I think building real dialogue with the small island developing states of the Pacific has got to be a goal of Australian foreign policy, and one we pursue more seriously than we have in the past.
It's about walking that fine line, isn't it, Bob, and not conceding too much. It's just rhetoric at the moment, but what do you think on that front?
Well, I think one lesson out of recent exchanges is that both sides have got to be careful. Both sides have got to be careful about responding to headlines. So the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, made 4 points at the start of his exchange with Penny Wong. They weren't demands, and half a dozen Chinese experts in Australia said they were wrongly interpreted by the Australian media as being demands. I would say that was media headline making shorthand to describe them as demands. And then Anthony Albanese gets asked at a media conference, what do you make of these Chinese demands? Well, they weren't demands, but he says things that end up getting reported as a rebuff to China. It wasn't a rebuff, and they weren't demands. And my advice to Chinese diplomats, my advice to people in DFAT, is that we've got to be very, very careful about talking through media caricatures and talking through headlines. We both want a relationship that, without sacrificing our key interests, enables us to talk about things that count, the things we've got in common.
As I read your column this morning, it struck me how much the relationship with China and the world order has changed in just 10 years, how much stronger, how much more bolshy China has become. As we talk about climate and the way that, Labor seeks to get back those Pacific partners, I mean, there's a real fine line to walk here, isn't there, between the international popularity on the world stage, if you like, but also domestic, parochial demands when it comes to energy?
There are a lot of concerns. When you make foreign policy, you've got to weigh them. But with skill, it can be done. I think this government is off to an extraordinarily good start when it comes to diplomacy. The feeling in Southeast Asia, for example, is that there is a government that is more attuned and that listens and doesn't take by surprise our neighbours in ASEAN, that recognises ASEAN's centrality, which is very important when you're talking to Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. It was tremendous to see a joint article in the Financial Review this morning by our Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, and the Finance Minister of Indonesia. That's the sort of collaborative projection of our concerns that confirms Australia's working more closely and more effectively with Southeast Asia. And when it comes to our China relationship, the Southeast Asians don't want to be put in a position where there's a Cold War they've got to commit to between China and the US. They would welcome a more sophisticated and more nuanced approach by Australia, which is what Penny Wong and Richard Marles and Anthony Albanese are working towards.
What is your advice to those three? Because I would argue that the previous government, wrongly or rightly, made it electorally popular to be seen to be standing up to China. Now, I'm not sure that is the view in terms of one homogenous group in the business community, but that is a big ship for Labor to try and turn around.
Yeah, I've got a somewhat different view. We've both got to be careful about generalising. I think both you and I can be right about this. But my impression in the Teal seats was that the Teal candidates didn't lose by saying there should be more diplomacy in the Australia-China relationship. And when the government tried in the election campaign with a billboard on a truck, a great advertising gimmick, to suggest that Anthony Albanese was a tool of Xi Jinping casting a vote for Labor, it fell flat. It fell flat. Especially when the government's maladroit management of our relationship with Solomon Islands became clear. That wasn't an asset for them at all. But just bear this in mind, and I note it, I don't say we've got to respond to it, but the shift among Chinese background voters not being manipulated by the Communist Party of China, but just responding to the awful rhetoric coming from Dutton and Pazuello, delivered Labor its working majority on the floor of the parliament. The swinging subdivisions in Bennelong, for example, and Reed and Chisholm, the swinging subdivisions where there was a high proportion of Chinese background voters, delivered Labor those seats and confirmed Labor's hold on Parramatta when the government had hopes of clawing it back from Labor. And it's not because they had dual loyalties, but Chinese background voters just were quite uneasy and uncomfortable with drums of war rhetoric, Peter Dutton giving the impression that we're off to war with China in the next year.
That certainly seemed to be the case in some of those seats around Melbourne as well. Now, as we sit here and, as I mentioned, we're fresh off the back of the Pacific Islands Forum, there was an embrace, a hug between Anthony Albanese and the Solomon Islands PM, and there was an undertaking privately and publicly that there'd be no military bases from China on the Solomon Islands. I mean, that undertaking is good. And do you think that's rock solid? You know, can we take that to the bank? How do we view that?
Well, these small island developing states are members of the non-aligned movement or sympathise with the non-aligned movement. And when there was a tremendous beat-up in the Australian press a couple of years ago about Vanuatu hosting a Chinese base, absolutely no evidence behind the headlines whatsoever, and then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull rubbished the suggestion in the end. The Prime Minister of Vanuatu at the time simply pointed out, we're in the non-aligned movement, we're not going to host foreign bases of any kind. Now, we should bear in mind that these small island developing states are not Australian dependencies. They don't concede that they're in Australian sphere of influence, but they will make decisions in their own national interest. They'll want to have a dialogue with China. I don't believe any of them in the foreseeable future are going to contemplate compromising their own independence, antagonising Australia and the US by offering to host a Chinese facility. And I think in the context of an improved relationship between us and China, China would steer away from such adventurism. They'd be roundly criticised, and it would get not just attention from the US and us, but attention from the European states with which they're conducting relationships.
Bob Carr, it's always quite puzzling that Australia is under so much pressure diplomatically from the Pacific Island nations when it comes to climate change. And it's often seen in a binary sense between Australia and China. And China is by far a bigger emitter. Why do we have such a bad reputation when China far outweighs anything we have done or can do?
China is a big emitter. Like us, it's heavily dependent on coal for its energy. But just bear this in mind, it's something we've got to build on as part of a more nuanced policy towards China, a more pragmatic policy towards China. China in 1 year, this is unrivaled in the world, has doubled its commitment to solar year on year. And similarly, when it comes to electric vehicles, China is electrifying its vehicle fleet as no other country has. The same set of statistics showed me that they have doubled electric vehicle take-up year on year. Now, the world renewables sector would be nothing were it not for this huge investment by China. And here's an opportunity for people who want us to compete with China and want America's partners to compete with China. Here's the opportunity to have competition when it comes to the decarbonisation agenda. I think nothing would be more exciting than to have India, a member of the Quad, a partner of Australia's and America's, engaged in competition with China to see which can become the biggest generator of solar in the world. Now, India will have to go quite a way to catch up with China, but that's the sort of geostrategic competition I would like, because the planet stands to benefit as we stand on the brink of 2 degrees warming, even more. That would be a disaster for the 193 nations of the Earth.
Bob Carr, pleasure to talk to you. We'll chat soon. Thanks so much.
Good, Lara. Thanks very much.